Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. My name is Ben Frost. I'm the Public Information Officer of APA's Northern New England chapter and one of the coordinators of the Planning Webcast series. This series is brought to you by a consortium of over 40 of APA's chapters and divisions. The consortium itself is not affiliated with APA, but rather is a loose-knit association whose mission is to provide high-quality free webinars on topics important to planners that will also help them meet their certification maintenance requirements. Today is Friday, October 27th, 2017, and we'll hear the presentation, Nurturing Your Entrepreneurial Ecosystem. For technical help during today's webcast, please type your questions in the chat box found on the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or call the 1-800 number shown for truly technical questions that I can't help you with. For content-related questions related to the presentation, type those questions in the question box on the webinar toolbar on the right side of your screen. We'll answer those questions as time allows at the end of the presentation during Q&A. And here's a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. I want to thank all of them for making these webcasts possible. Today's webcast is sponsored by APA's Economic Development Division. And here's a few of our upcoming webcasts. Some of the topics are yet to be determined. To register for these webcasts, please visit our website at www.ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. To log your CM credits for this session, which is good for live viewing only, log into your account on planning.org, and you can search for this by the event number, which is 9135185. You can like us on Facebook and learn all the upcoming information on the webcast series. And we're recording today's webcast, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. You can go there on YouTube and search Planning Webcast to find all of our recordings. A PDF of the PowerPoint will also be available on the Ohio Planning website. And now I want to turn it over to today's speaker, Sarah Lyon-Hill. Sarah, take it away.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. So my name is Sarah Lyon-Hill. Excuse me one sec here. Okay, and everyone should see my screen, I take it?
Yep, looking good.
Looking good? Okay. My name is Sarah Lyon-Hill. I'm Senior Economic Development Specialist at the Virginia Tech Office of Economic Development. Our office is part of Virginia Tech, and as part of Virginia Tech is a land grant institution. So as part of its kind of outreach mission, our office attempts to not only connect different communities and industries and businesses with the resources of the university, such as through expertise, research, and different connections with faculty, but we also do a lot of applied research. It's kind of in our consulting form. So we will do research anywhere from looking at workforce and doing workforce studies, doing feasibility and economic impact studies, strategic planning and facilitation for different industry groups, as well as doing work within entrepreneurship itself. And so that's kind of what brings us to this project that our office did about last year. We finished it up. Basically, our region is in far southwest Virginia. It is located in the Roanoke and Blacksburg metropolitan statistical areas. And this area has, at least for the past decade, really been kind of wanting to understand how it could develop a more vibrant innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem. About 7 years ago, it developed a blueprint for innovation in the region. And in that blueprint, it called for a way that we could measure the region more using innovation metrics as well as entrepreneurial metrics. So it took a little while for the region to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? At the same time, you have the Kauffman Foundation located in Kansas City, who was developing its own framework for measuring an entrepreneurial ecosystem. In about 2016, it put out a proposal for different research projects, an RFP that our office answered, basically to vet the framework that it had developed. And so that is where this project came about. So we wanted to know better, one, how our region could measure its entrepreneurial ecosystem, and then two, how we could honestly really help other regions understand how it might use the Kauffman framework, and what other metrics are out there that regions can use, both rural and urban. So to begin with, I just want to talk a little bit about what an entrepreneurial ecosystem is. It's a bit of a jargony word that I think economic developers use a lot. You hear entrepreneurs using them, but not everyone. It's still a little bit jargony, I would say. So when we really talk about entrepreneurial ecosystems, it really talks about all of the actors, networks, and activities that make startups and small businesses possible. So that is all of the organizations that serve as resources to entrepreneurs, the education resources, such as community colleges in the region, as well as the activities when we say we're talking about pitch competitions or startup weekends. And then it's really the startups and small businesses themselves. And when I say startups and small businesses, I'm differentiating a little bit because we all know that in many cases, a small business may not necessarily consider itself a startup. It may not, an owner of a small business may not even necessarily consider themselves an entrepreneur. When we were approaching this, in our opinion, we pretty much considered most people who were willing to take that risk to start a business as being an entrepreneur, but it is very much a self-ascribed title, I would say. So why do we promote entrepreneurial ecosystems? And I think most of you, since you're here today, probably kind of know this already. But this topic really has become more prominent since during and since the recession, with the growth of the gig economy and the growing understanding of the importance of small business. If you see on the screen, there are several statistics from the Small Business Administration really showing that small businesses really provide a large proportion of the jobs in our nation on average. They've grown significantly and are really projected to grow as long as we as government entities and support organizations help them along. And then why do we measure these entrepreneurial ecosystems? Why has this really become such a large issue? Honestly, and I think kind of across the board, the idea of focusing on outcomes-based programs and thus measuring those programs has become very important in workforce, in education, in any economic development programs. So this is also, I would say, the case for when dealing with the development and growth of entrepreneurship within a region. There's kind of two sides of why one would actually want to measure an entrepreneurial ecosystem. On one side, there's kind of this outward-facing audience, those who are not within the ecosystem itself and not in the know. Those are people within the region who may be new to entrepreneurship and developing a small business. They don't know exactly where to go, and who to talk to, how they go about starting their business. And if we measure an entrepreneurial ecosystem, if we map it out, that helps them along the way and facilitates their growth and success within the region. Then you see those outside the region. It also shows how well the region is doing to them. It can attract businesses, it can attract talent to the region who really wants to live in a entrepreneurial rich environment. So in many ways it is a marketing approach to showing how well the region is doing. On the other side, you have kind of the internal audience, those within the ecosystem who are working within this network of different startups, of different resource entities. And for that, they really want to know, okay, how are we doing and how can we do better? So we want to understand, one, how an ecosystem functions and who's included in that ecosystem. Again, that refers a lot to mapping the ecosystem and mapping who's involved, what they do, how are we all connected. It's also understanding the gaps and strengths of the ecosystem. What strengths can we build on? What gaps do we need to fill to make us better? And then it's also, in many respects, we want to compare ourselves to our peers and how we're doing over time. So that longitudinal analysis and also that comparative analysis to other regions who are doing just as well or maybe doing better than us, and we want to step up. So as I said, the research we did was inspired in many parts through the Kauffman Foundation and their framework for understanding and measuring an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And they basically identified 4 different indicators that really kind of show different aspects of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And all 4 of those indicators are very important to how an entrepreneurial ecosystem functions, how it's not just talking about individual actors or the number of actors even. It's talking about, how are they in terms of their density, how do they exchange resources, how do they connect, and are they diverse enough to really create those opportunities for collision and for innovation. So I'll talk a little bit about these. For one, so at the beginning they have density, and that's honestly, we're talking about relative density of entrepreneurship. And this is a very large indicator, not necessarily what you would say as a measure, because how would you measure density? There's actually many different ways to measure density. And at the end of this presentation, I will have my email address. Throughout this process, we kind of collected a lot of different metrics or measures, as I'm going to use those kind of synonymously, for measuring density, fluidity, connectivity, and diversity. There are a lot of different ways, and I would definitely recommend, if you were thinking of measuring your ecosystem, you really need to think of an assortment of metrics and how they are related to each other and how they do reflect these 4 different indicators. So density, for example, relative density of entrepreneurship can be the number of startups per 100,000 people, for example. And so how close-knit are they? So if it's kind of the logical economic argument, if you have large close-knit organizations together, the opportunities for growth, the opportunities for collision are greater, and that can lead to more growth and expansion. Fluidity is the accessibility and easy flow of resources in an ecosystem. So it's not important just to have a number of different resources, but but you need to show not only, okay, I have this number of programs in my for this type of SBDC program, but this is the number of startups, the number of organizations that are benefiting from this program. So different metrics or measures that illustrate how different resources are being used, how they're flowing into and out of different startups and small businesses. Connectivity, that's connections among the elements of the ecosystem. It's programs, companies, and individuals. So when we talk about connectivity, often people think of network analysis. This is kind of probably one of the more cutting edge, I would say, I guess, or kind of the new approaches to analysis in understanding where are our key nodes within the network. And when I say nodes, it could be one membership organization that actually has so many members and so many connections to other organizations that by filtering information to that organization, you can get the information to all of these other organizations within the network. It can also show through a network analysis different communities that exist, with different communities or different kind of clusters of networks within an ecosystem. For instance, you have your startup high growth entrepreneurs might function within a different part of the ecosystem, and so therefore would show up differently in this network analysis compared to small Main Street businesses with which may function and operate through other organizations within the ecosystem and within the network analysis. And there are a lot of different tools for network analysis that you can use to kind of understand and see how like larger, more prominent organizations within the ecosystem, how they connect with other organizations, and how they kind of all integrate as one. But the key point is really if you're going to have a strong and vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem, you really do have to make sure that a lot of your organizations are highly connected and integrated with one another. They're communicating with each other. They are sharing resources and they're sharing information. And you can do that through understanding secondary data. Like for us, for example, I'll show this later, we used Twitter to do a network analysis. However, at the same time, we also did a survey of different entrepreneurs to understand how they're using different resource organizations, and we did a network analysis that way. In another project, we actually looked at the connectivity of workforce organizations. The workforce system, at least in Virginia, but I'm assuming in many other states, is highly diverse, and it has many organizations are working within the same region. And again, understanding what information they're sharing, how they're partnering with other organizations will help to show how connected and how cohesive the whole programming works within your region. Then finally, you have diversity. And diversity is, this can be diversity of people. So if we're looking at a region and understanding the number of like immigrants, the number of migrants coming into the region, understanding the socioeconomic and racial diversity within a region, but that also the diversity of industries. Again, in terms of economic development, you never want to be reliant on just one industry or particularly one business or one company. So understanding that you want a diversity of people, you want a diversity of industry, a diversity of organizations that help entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of different walks of life is important to that vibrancy within an ecosystem. So that is kind of Kauffman's framework, and we used that, but we also integrated a kind of our own understanding of metrics and how they work. And that's where you see in the lower left-hand corner the input, direct outcome, and indirect outcome. Some people also call this inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And that is very much referring to kind of a logic model approach to understanding metrics and understanding measures. So understanding, for instance, the number of resources or how or measuring any kind of resource, that would be more of an input. If you're measuring your ecosystem just in terms of inputs, you may not actually have the best ecosystem ever. You would simply have a lot of resources, but were those actually translating into good economic outcomes? We're not sure. Direct outcomes are those measures that talk more about how the resources are used and directly translate into companies or into startups within an ecosystem. That's when we're talking about the participants within these different organizations that provide resources to start companies and start small businesses. And then you have those the indirect outcomes, which are really those larger macroeconomic indicators that, quite honestly, you can't say that an entrepreneurial ecosystem directly contributes to the GDP or the economic growth of a region, but it does contribute. So it's kind of those larger macroeconomic indicators. And I'll go a little bit, this provides some more examples of that. So again, we identified, and a lot of the times, again, this is according to your own region, and you have to kind of sit down with your partners and decide, okay, what do we consider as the inputs within the inputs and the resources to the activities that we have going on within our ecosystem? What are the direct results of those inputs, or what are at least what we want to be the direct results of those inputs and those resources? And inevitably, what do we want to come out of this entire process? So inputs can be R&D intensity, access to capital, technical assistance, the number of technical assistance programs, the type of technical assistance programs, all of those resources that then may result in, the startup density. Again, talking about the number of startups per 100,000 people or so, or millions, which are depending on the size of your region. Number of startups coming from programs. Again, that's kind of that's a fluidity sort of metrics to say, okay, we have these resources, but how are they being used? How are they flowing into direct outcomes? As well as small business employment, because at the end of the day, we want to grow business to make jobs and create and help people with their livelihoods and quality of life. And again, these indirect outcomes are those larger macroeconomic sort of indicators. A lot of them are easy to pull for secondary data. That's when you can go to, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Economic Analysis. Stats America has a very interesting innovation index, as well as many other wonderful information and data bits that are just fun to play around with. And again, these are very much these are measures that you want to know and understand how the region is doing. But you have to understand those in the larger realm of activities, not just the entrepreneurial ecosystem, but in the realm of what's education and the education system doing, what are economic developers doing, what is workforce doing, etc. So these are much larger measures and metrics. But understanding this kind of logic model in this way helps different organizations and different regions to know not only what efforts are we putting into this, but what are the outcomes of those efforts. There is an underlying assumptions in that, and so that's one way to kind of test those assumptions in some respects. But it also is something that you have to kind of understand the logic of why are we doing what we're doing. I would say also know, and I bring this up later, but a lot of these metrics, sometimes they're easy to collect through secondary data sources. Again, through government data sources, some proprietary data sources. Our office, for example, uses MC, which a workforce and economic development tool that helps us a lot with our industry and employment data and workforce data. There's also Jobs EQ through Chimera that's very useful and a very similar tool. All of these are very good, but at the end of the day, sometimes there also has to be a lot of primary data collection. And if a region really wants to understand the nuances and collect some of these really vital metrics, it has to be through surveys, through interviews that are relatively regularly collected. I would say annually or biannually, which means you have to get a lot of buy-in from your partners, or at least start small and then hopefully grow from there. So this is a map of the region that we went through, that we studied. We call it the Roanoke-Blacksburg region. Virginia Tech is in the orange in the Blacksburg region, New River Valley. Roanoke is the maroon. Yes, Virginia Tech does do maroon and orange, so this is a little Virginia Techy, I apologize. But so this is the region that we're looking at, and when we were talking with Kauffman and proposing this project, one of the unique aspects of this region we thought would kind of really speak to a lot of other regions in the US is that this region is a mix of both urban and rural areas. Most of the research that has been done on entrepreneurial ecosystems really looks at the larger metropolitan regions in the United States. Collecting particularly secondary data in these larger regions is much, much simpler. When you're looking at more rural areas, data collection can be far more difficult. The government doesn't necessarily collect so much data to have a large enough N to go that onto the county level or local levels with a lot of the data they collect. At best, you will get MSA level data, and obviously we don't all live in MSAs. We tried to make this fairly unique. We tried to have this research be fairly unique in that it is urban and rural, and so how do we collect measures and how do we respect both environments and both kinds of communities? We also wanted to look at the differences between kind of those high growth entrepreneurs, what we call innovation-driven enterprises. Those are often the ones who call themselves entrepreneurs, and they're very strong about that. But then also kind of the small business entrepreneurs, the small business owners. the small and medium enterprises. And this is how we differentiate between those two. So when we're talking about small and medium enterprises, and obviously this is a continuum, it's not a full-fledged dichotomy, but you have small and medium enterprises, you know, they are more focused on the more local and regional markets. While innovation isn't necessary, it could be there, but the business may be more of, say, we're starting a food business, which the food could be very innovative in its own way, but they aren't looking to grow that business through their innovation. Employees are local or regional. Funding is often, you know, by themselves, through family, bank loans, debt financing, and these businesses tend to experience linear growth. In contrast, innovation-driven entrepreneurs, often when we call gazelles, they are looking to their global markets. They're innovation-driven. They want to create, you know, the newest technology, the newest process or product. They can have employees anywhere, really, because they expand. And the funding they really are looking for is angel and venture capital. And you know, the business really initially loses money, but then it grows exponentially by the end, if successful, obviously. But these, we wanted to look at both of these because honestly, both of these groups are very important. The majority of small businesses you're going to see are small and medium enterprises, and they really help towards the quality of life of a region. They really kind of are the foundation of most regions. These innovation-driven enterprises, these gazelles, are few and far between. They help with those. They help contribute to driver industries. They can actually exhibit great growth and be a catalyst for a community. However, I would argue they rely very much on these small and medium enterprises because at the end of the day, how are you going to attract workers? How are you going to attract talent? How are you going to grow in a region that doesn't have all of these small businesses, all of these great, useful, and service-oriented organizations that help towards your quality of life? So we wanted to understand both the resources of both, how they function within the ecosystem. So our research questions. What are the requirements of differing types of entrepreneurs within an ecosystem? So when we say different types, those are, again, our small and medium enterprises and our innovation-driven enterprises. How can we identify useful and practical metrics to assess how well ecosystems function to support different types of entrepreneurs? Again, we need to really, when we're thinking of these metrics, we need to think about that logic model, the inputs, the direct outcomes, and the indirect outcomes. We need to think about how those metrics potentially reflect the density, fluidity, connectivity, and diversity of an ecosystem, all of which kind of contribute to that vibrancy. But we should also think about metrics that are reflective of both kinds of small businesses and both kinds of entrepreneurs within an ecosystem. So this is getting slightly, so you thinking about, keep those three things in mind. And then what are the dynamics of ecosystems with a mix of both urban and rural features? So how do we collect metrics in more rural regions? How do the dynamics shift and change when you're looking at a region that could be more urban and more rural, and the different needs of both? So for this research, we conducted about 44 interviews with entrepreneurs and intermediaries. We did an entrepreneurial survey where we asked entrepreneurs about the resources they use, about their own organizations, and what industries they're in. And then again, we reviewed a lot of secondary metrics data. We compiled a very long list of over 100 different metrics that fell within Kauffman's the 4 different indicators, identifying whether we thought they were inputs, direct outcomes, or indirect outcomes, and understanding how they could be collected, particularly in more rural areas. To your right, you'll see kind of a breakdown of the industry survey, and to see kind of how our region, at least based on the survey responses, breaks down. Again, we had a lot of support services. We had quite a few IT-related responses, which was useful. Retail, outdoors related, because particularly the Roanoke area has really pushed that industry in our region, so we had quite a few of those, as well as biology and biotech, which the Roanoke-Blacksburg region, through a partnership between Virginia Tech and the healthcare system, currently healthcare system in the region, has really pushed and wanted to expand in the area. We had a pretty good mix of IDE as well as SME entrepreneurs respond as well. Kind of a synopsis of the results here. We saw that, the strengths in our region, when people, both through interviews and through surveys, people talked about kind of a region that was very hungry for anything. There was a lot of enthusiasm within the region for entrepreneurship and developing our entrepreneurial ecosystem. The great thing is this region is really great for informal networking. There's so many different places for collision, different activities where people can meet and talk and learn from one another. This region, really, people talked about the quality of life in the Roanoke-Blacksburg area, particularly with the outdoors, kind of the growing entrepreneurial state, where you have some of these small, medium enterprises such as coffee shops, breweries, and places where people can really hang out and enjoy each other's company. There are growing entrepreneurial resources. People noted since for the last 10 years, the entrepreneurial resources in the region have more than doubled. There's also a skilled workforce that's coming out of many of the higher education institutions in the region, from Virginia Tech, from Radford University, from several of its colleges, as well as its community colleges. And then again, so I said a lot of higher education institutions. People noted that the region is friendly and supportive, and there are lots of open doors. However, in contrast to that, people did mention that, people are very enthusiastic, but how is that translating into successes? And do we really highlight and market those successes? And is it just much rah-rah and not many outcomes coming out of that? There is little support for scaling up businesses, a lack of interagency collaboration. So again, that comes back to this connectivity indicator. Are different organizations working with each other, sharing information, or in the case of one entrepreneur noted that they had to go to, I think, 4 different offices and kept getting bounced around like a yo-yo, they basically said, because these offices didn't necessarily know what the other ones were doing. They said, well, we don't do that, so try going here. And so there wasn't that friendly customer service, there wasn't that knowledge of what other organizations are doing. And as a result, the entrepreneur felt fairly alienated, which doesn't necessarily lead to success there. This region also lacks a lot of early stage funding, which a lot of people noted, and mentors. And even since this since we completed this research, both of those points, talking about early stage funding and mentorship, various organizations have actually acted upon that results and are developing programs that will help, that have helped with mentorship and that hopefully will help with developing and attracting early stage funding, a lot of angel funding in the region. This region, when we talk about entrepreneurship, risk is very huge in it, and there has to be, in many cases, a culture of risk where people are willing to, put up some money, put up some resources, hoping that, this business will be successful. Many people said in this region there's very little culture of risk, and many of the organizations that provide funding are not necessarily don't necessarily feel comfortable taking the risk on a lot of these different burgeoning startups. However, on the other side of things, you also heard people saying that a lot of these startups aren't ready for the funding and they aren't ready for the financing. So again, through mentorship, through different organizations, how do we help these startups get ready and prepared to show themselves off to potential investors and get that money? People said that there was a need for more inclusion, particularly in Roanoke. People had mentioned that if you're in, if you're in the network, you're golden. If you know someone and they know other people, you're fine. But if you don't know anyone, you're kind of out in the cold. And in the case of particularly minorities in the region, they're definitely out in the cold. They don't necessarily use the resources, and in some ways, due to a lot of historical challenges, they're afraid to use the resources in the region. So how do you really address that challenge in the area, particularly when you want a very diverse, a socially diverse ecosystem? And then people mentioned, while there is a lot of higher education, they wanted more collaboration from these higher education institutions, particularly Virginia Tech. And they wanted more help from Virginia Tech, particularly in research, in helping them to start to provide the expertise, and maybe perhaps have spin-outs from the university. What can the university do in the region, particularly as a land-grant institution? So what we took from this, particularly when other regions are thinking about their own entrepreneurial ecosystem, how to, one, develop it and how to, two, measure it, we kind of had three broad areas that we think people really, regions need to really consider as they move forward. One is fostering an entrepreneurial climate of encouragement and inclusion. So how do we make the ecosystem more transparent to those who are not on the inside, who are not within the ecosystem, particularly underrepresented populations? Number two, develop resources appropriate for different entrepreneur types and stages. Again, when we're thinking about our entrepreneurial ecosystem, we need to think about all the different types of business. We found, as we thought we would find, that you do have these high growth startups, these innovation-driven enterprises. You have these small and medium enterprises, these your Main Street businesses, sometimes lifestyle businesses. You also, and what we found was, you have businesses that really have potential to scale up. They have moved past that startup phase. They could scale up. They could, grow in the region, have more jobs, and how do you support that? And then three, again, this research really did confirm our assumption that regions have to adopt indicators and inventories of the different resources and entities within their ecosystem to make themselves more transparent and to understand how they can develop in the future, understand their strengths, understand their weaknesses, and understand how, and think more analytically of how they can move forward to nurture small businesses and startups. So particularly for this audience, what can planners do? What can government do? There are some areas and some ideas that we thought. So when thinking of fostering an entrepreneurial climate of encouragement and inclusion, be a platform and be a convener of resource providers to encourage more collaboration among resource providers. So you can increase that connectivity. Number 2, encourage more openness from higher education institutions. And in many cases, as again, outcomes-based measures really become more and more prevalent and more important, hopefully higher education institutions start to think of, okay, what is our economic impact on our regions? How do we affect, not only through training our students, but also through other aspects and other activities, do we encourage the growth of our ecosystems and our regions? 3, so acknowledging the tension between emerging entrepreneurs, seeking flexibility and innovative approaches to commercialization. This one very much is about, again, entrepreneurs are very, very different. You're going to have, particularly with small and medium enterprises, but even other businesses, you're going to have businesses that want the more brick and mortar approach to doing business, and they're going to need they're going to need those spaces to put their businesses. They're going to need kind of to establish themselves. But on the other side, there's that the growing prevalence of the lean startup model. And so you're going to have entrepreneurs that want to start little by little, that are going to need little bits of startup funding and seed funding, and slowly they'll grow, and eventually they're going to need that space. So having different resources there available to for the needs of all of these types of entrepreneurs, and being flexible in that way. And this is particularly towards the resource providers themselves, understanding that, you know, not all business is different, not all business is the same, and not all startups are going to be the same. And then understanding barriers that lead to fragmentation within the ecosystem. And that is one of those things that, for instance, government should understand. Is it serving as a barrier, or is it serving as a facilitator to different resources? Even when it comes to licensing, even when it comes to, again, understanding the different needs of entrepreneurs and helping them to reach those resources. Even barriers when we discuss, again, the socioeconomic barriers, those entrepreneurs in minority communities. What are the barriers to their access to resources, and how do we improve those over time? And to the right on that is the, as I had said before, that is the one of the network analyses that we provided. The different colors actually represent kind of what in a network analysis is called as like different communities within the larger network. They are different nodes that are closer to one another, that kind of interact more closely. So in the case of this network in the green, those are largely small and medium enterprises, some high growth startups that are within the Roanoke region, particularly the city of Roanoke. Whereas in the purple, you see that a lot of these are resources and a few startups that are in the New River Valley or Blacksburg, in proximity to the Blacksburg-Christiansburg area of the region. And then there are other different colors that also represent, in the pink you see two prominent companies in our region that you could talk about, you could say are innovation-driven enterprises in the Blacksburg region. So this is, and now I'm forgetting what tool we used for this, but basically the, and if you are interested, please email me. But this tool basically identifies these different communities, and it kind of it shows. So we do have it shows kind of who are the prominent players. Here are the top like 20 nodes, I think, within our ecosystem, according to Twitter, at least on social media, they're the most prominent, and kind of how they're connected to one another. This kind of does show kind of how a bit of a vibrancy, particularly within our kind of small and medium enterprises, and how small and medium enterprises within breweries, within coffee houses, and how they connect to our high growth region, our high growth enterprises in the region. Okay, so next, develop resources appropriate for different entrepreneur types and stages. Financial resources are very important. So how does government, both at the state and local levels, encourage more financial resources in the area and access to those financial resources? Part of that is really just identifying those resources for entrepreneurs. And another part is, can we help these entrepreneurs and these small businesses be ready to ask for these financial resources? To internet services, particularly in our rural areas, this was highlighted as a very large need for small businesses. In rural areas, they don't have as much access to broadband services, and that hinders them and their growth as small businesses. There are many opportunities for small and medium enterprises to look beyond their local communities for sales. They can sell on the internet very easily, but if they don't have access to high-speed broadband, that makes it far more difficult. The idea of kind of meetups and forums designed for industry-specific businesses was talked about by actually quite a few entrepreneurs. Many of them mentioned that while our region while the Roanoke-Blacksburg region has a lot of opportunities for meetups and collisions, and again, this informal networking, many of them were just overpowered by resource providers. And quite honestly, if someone could serve as a facilitator and to hold meetings among different business groups, among the different industry groups, so they could just talk amongst themselves to understand their needs and to communicate with one another, kind of just initiating that process, that would be helpful for a lot of entrepreneurs within particular industries. And then harness the power of successful entrepreneurs. This was mentioned again by quite a few, and this is there are case studies across the U.S. that really talk about how successful entrepreneurs and serial entrepreneurs really turn into the mentors that new entrepreneurs need. And they also can provide funding and additional financing. They become angel investors. So really developing relationships with those successful entrepreneurs and the serial entrepreneurs, making sure that they know they are valued, and helping more entrepreneurs become successful. Again, kind of, it's that positive effect that keeps growing. And then finally, we get kind of back to our metrics, is adopting indicators and inventories, which is, again, as I said, important for both internal and external audiences. As I said before, a lot of the metrics that we identified, which again are probably over 100 metrics, so many of them could be through the secondary sources, and these can be used as benchmarks, as benchmark metrics with our peer regions. The downfall of secondary metrics is, they do lag behind. Many of the metrics that we found were for 2014, 2015, and by the time we were done with this project, it was 2016, end of 2016, 2017. But those are, I think those are probably some of the only ways that you can really kind of compare your region with other peer regions and see how you're doing in comparison. Then there really is, and we found this was incredibly important, the idea of collecting primary data for longitudinal analysis. We did ask, both through our surveys and through our interviews, so what metrics and what data would you like to see about our region? And the majority of metrics that people really talked about and asked for required primary data and the data collection. They really wanted to know kind of these small little bitty things that you're not gonna get from any government data source or survey of national survey. So primary data collection can take place through entrepreneurial and business surveys, service provider surveys, collective metrics gathering. In I think Grand Rapids, Michigan right now, there is an organization an actual startup who is starting to look at ways of doing collective metrics gathering. I think they've already started. When I talked with them, they said, start small, try to get some organizations on board that will basically collect the same metrics, basically gain their buy-in. They will collect similar, the same sort of measures and metrics over time. They can even, particularly if they work with entrepreneurs and small businesses, they can work within the contract of when a business owner or entrepreneur comes to them, they can say, we will provide this service for you as long as you provide us with this data from time to time, and then through that you can collect all of you can gather all of these similar metrics to really understand what's going on at the regional level, and ideally most of those metrics then would be anonymous for other organizations. So I guess the incentive for these different organizations is, if you can, and again this requires one group to gather this data and analyze it. The incentive for these participating resource providers would be, they could get this data analyzed for them to understand, their impacts over time. But then, that the identifying data could be wiped, and the region itself could then understand how well it's doing over time. And then there's the idea of dashboards, marketing websites, reports, and conferences. The idea of not only just collecting this data, but how do you publish it and how do you show it to audiences, again, both internally and externally. So talking about your inventories and talking about your mapping your ecosystem and saying, hey, here's who we are, where we are. If you need this resource, this is where you should go. But then also saying, here's what our region is up to, and here's here's how we're doing over time. Here's how we've done over time, and here are the areas that we're working on. I would say if you're interested in sort of dashboards in that way, the Kansas City LinkedIn, SourceLink dashboard is quite impressive. That is probably one of the dashboards that I have found most interesting. So that is about it for what I had to say. Here are obviously the contributors to our research. And again, we do have a full report, which has a lot more detailed data in it. It has a list of over 100 possible metrics to collect. Basically, it's a matrix that basically says, hey, here's the metric. It's kind of an input. It might be an output or an outcome of some sort. It could directly align with this Kauffman indicator. Here's where you could get it. And really, can you collect it at the county level? Can you collect it at the MSA level? Or is it really a metric that you can only really have at the state level? And that is my email address. So I guess I'm ready for questions.
Okay, Sarah, that's great. Thanks a lot. This is, for someone who doesn't do this in my day job, this is a really interesting presentation. So we have a few questions, and I want to encourage people to type them into the question box so that we can take them up. I guess the first comment and the most important one comes from Sarah, and she says, and I think this is relative to the map you showed, Sarah, with the Vermont Tech, or the Virginia Tech colors. She says, "Go Hokies."
Yeah.
So Cindy asks, when you say region, what kind of geographic area do you need to measure the an entrepreneurial ecosystem? Could you apply this to a county with a population of, say, 62,000?
That's a really good question. I would say we definitely looked at a region, and part of it is this idea of is it real, like, what does your economy look like? I think an entrepreneurial ecosystem often can align with a county in many respects, an economy in many respects. Where are your entrepreneurs going? Are they staying within your county? Are they pulling the resources from your county? Obviously, there are state resource and national resources they pull from, but when you're thinking about where the closest SVDC is, or where where an incubator is, or an accelerator, that's probably when you want to start thinking about how large do you want to consider your entrepreneurial ecosystem. So yeah, does that answer the question, I hope?
Well, we'll find out. We've got a follow-up question.
Yes.
And we have a comment here from Debarga regarding the network analysis that you showed, and he's asking if this was prepared using Gephi, G-E-P-H-I.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it was used Gephi. Yeah, we used Gephi.
Okay. So I have, as people put in their questions, I was thinking about my own questions as you were talking, and one thing that you touched upon a couple times was the role of institutions of higher education in, in one case being a barrier because there wasn't enough collaboration, but also I would say in facilitating the development or the birth of entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I'm thinking back to my own graduate research decades ago with regard to Route 128 around Boston and the policies of MIT, which really drove a lot of innovation. To what degree do we need to rely on major institutions like that? Are they necessary, or are there other sorts of elements that could fill that space?
Good question. I would say the role of higher education is very important. When you're looking at some of the most vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems and startup communities in the U.S., often higher education institution serves as at least one anchor institution in that ecosystem. I would definitely say, and this can be very hard because these are very large systems, so you can't necessarily say influence them other than say, oh, come on, what are you guys doing? Please improve your policies so your patenting is easier. So we can gain more access to your IP. So your faculty will work with us more. So you can encourage your students to make more partnerships within the region, so your students will probably stay in the region post-graduation. I would say if you can, and if you have a good enough relationship with your higher education institution, that encouraging them to do those sorts of things, and showing how it would benefit them in many respects as well. Again, if you look at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities right now, and other kind of higher ed discussion groups, the idea of outcomes-based metrics for higher education within the economic development realm is becoming more and more of an issue. So talking to higher education institutions and encouraging them to do that, I think it would help the region a lot, because they do play a very, very important role. I'm sure but yeah, at the same time, there are, I would say, smaller ecosystems, not your larger, say, Boston sort of ecosystems that don't necessarily have that higher ed anchor, but I think they're few and far between.
So we have a follow-up from Cindy on that population question. And she says, one challenge we have is getting data from businesses. They don't want to answer questions. They don't want any government intervention. And she says, we don't even have a business license registry, so we have no idea what businesses are operating here. How do you get to that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Again, well, there are some proprietary sources that you can use, but they're incredibly expensive. I think talking with the people who have been at least starting to do this, they have really talked about, okay, if you get and this is, I kind of explained this earlier, businesses that are already turning to service providers in the area or in the county or the locality, if they can put within their kind of contract with these businesses of service provision to say, we're going to need some information from you, it will obviously stay completely anonymous. I feel like that's probably one of the easier ways to get information from businesses. Even in the survey that we had for entrepreneurs, I tried to be as easy as possible when asking about some of those kind of nitpicky questions when it came to, financial questions and issues. But yeah, again, I think that's probably one of your biggest challenges, and it's the idea is, okay, how I don't want to say coerce, but how do you encourage them to see, the benefits of this sort of work and helping them? Because at the end of the day, doing this sort of work is to help them. it's not necessarily to help government.
Right. So Lenore says, not sure about other states, but New Jersey requires businesses to register at the state level. Also, the county has an economic development section that keeps records. So I think this does vary a lot from state to state. And I know here in New Hampshire, there's no required registry for businesses. There's trade names. If you want to register your trade name, you do that, but you're not required to register with the government. So Stephanie asks, what is the best way to begin inventorying the various resource providers and enterprises in a region?
Well, how we approached it, we kind of identified a lot of the champions in the region usually the big names, and we started with them, interviewing them, talking with them, asking, okay, what other organizations do you know of? Luckily we benefited because the state of Virginia actually has a source link, a source link website for Virginia that lists a lot of the sources, but it's still not perfect. But again, it's a lot about talking to people. I would say like kind of snowball sampling, starting with a few people, looking on the internet, start pulling together that list, and then going to more people and saying, okay, who else should I talk to? Who else should I talk to? It takes a little bit of time, definitely. But I would say I would say it's worth it, because at the end of the day, when you see that list, it's quite impressive, and you're like, wow, we're doing pretty well. There's a lot of organizations that support this sort of work. Yeah. And then I would also, to add to that, once you do a lot of that footwork, start to think of ways of visualizing it and presenting it to stakeholders. Again, and I say this a lot, like KC SourceLink has this really great rail map that really does show all of the different resources that Kansas City has, and like kind of where along the small business kind of lifeline or life cycle that you can jump on to that rail and get the resources you need.
Question from Entrepreneurial, 100 possible metrics. Will you be measuring those annually, biennially, or so on?
For us, I would say at the end, we're not going to I would not do 100 possible metrics. Those were the ones that we found. I think at the end of the day, and we're still working on this in our region, we're getting a group where we know kind of who our stakeholders are, and we want to get a group together to identify, okay, what are the ones that really resonate with our stakeholders and that we think would help us. And that's when we need to start thinking intentionally about the inputs, the outputs, and the outcomes, and the different metrics that kind of fall within that, and kind of what are our goals. For instance, we did find that the inclusion was an issue in our area. So maybe we want to collect certain metrics that address that challenge, so we can see how we're doing over time. I think if that's so, for that, once we put that in place, ideally I would like to do it annually. Some measures, particularly secondary measures, are going to be contingent on when that source kind of updates its measure. But usually, I think most of at least the government sources that I found, they do annual data collection. Again, it's dated. It's like two years later, but so you'll have a lag in the data. But you could do it probably on an annual basis or biannual, depending on how many resources you want to put into it. I think what we're going to look at doing is potentially some sort of, do that, create some sort of website dashboard, and possibly have maybe an annual conference or gathering where we can kind of parse some of these trends out over time and talk about what our region needs to do moving forward based on the data that we're seeing.
Okay, so you said that your research has been supported by the Kauffman Foundation. Is that right?
Yes.
We have a question from James asking, is there any federal funding in this area?
Not that I know of, no, unfortunately. But if you find some, let me know.
I wonder if this might be of interest to some regional development corporations and doing some research like that, using perhaps some EDA funding, but I'm not familiar with it.
Possible, yeah.
So one thing I was thinking about too is, and it just came across my desk today, was the current issue of the Journal of the American Planning Association, the autumn 2017 edition, and within that is an article called "The Maker Movement and Urban Economic Development," which looks really interesting. And so I was thinking, as you were talking, Sarah, what do you see as the role of things like maker spaces or incubators in fostering an entrepreneurial ecosystem?
Incredibly important. I would say that the trends right now with maker spaces, co-working spaces, and particularly accelerators are showing that we've kind of honestly learned a lot from we've learned a lot from our past in terms of encouraging startups. These maker spaces, I think they're great for honestly encouraging that initial interest in entrepreneurship and innovation. Then you, with co-working spaces, you have that opportunity again, that lean startup opportunity. So you have a place, entrepreneurs have a place they can go that they can work at very low fees. And they can honestly, it's a great place for collaboration and learning from one another. We have actually we have two really great co-working spaces right now, one in Blacksburg and one in Roanoke, that the entrepreneurs that work there and that just go there to hang out and talk with one another, they said that they've really been able to learn from one another. They've been able to, pivot when they need to from different markets or different products. And then when you get to the accelerator kind of entity, we've just started one in Roanoke, and I've heard from a lot of other localities that kind of ability to do kind of a very short-term mentorship and kind of training for startups and small businesses to kind of give them that punch and give them that ability, that quick ability to get them ready for more funding and to accelerate and increase their workers and their jobs and growth over time has been really beneficial. I think, and honestly, when you're talking about metrics collection, those would be some of the great places to start really those organizations talking to and saying, hey, how do we kind of start collaborating to create and gain a better understanding of how we work together within a region or within a community, and how we can grow over time.
It seems like makerspaces would be great to foster a couple of the elements that you talked about, density and connectivity. I mean, they're all there together, kind of cooking their own stuff shoulder to shoulder. We do have actually, I want to back up to one thing you said, at least for my benefit only. Could you describe what you mean by accelerator?
Accelerator. It's somewhat similar to an incubator. However, most of the time it's basically the businesses have already kind of somewhat established themselves, and they really need just that extra push to grow. Essentially, they're startups. They want to very quickly start to grow their product, grow their market, and potentially grow their employment. It's different from an incubator in that a lot of the times they're not going to be there for years and years. It's a very kind of, it's usually a short-term program, and in addition to just space, they're given a lot of technical assistance. They go through classes of saying, hey, here's what you should do. They are given their connections to potential financing and to potential angel investors, venture capitalists, and they're really kind of given a lot of mentorship within a short period of time, so they can grow very quickly and succeed.
Thanks. That's very helpful for a novice like me. So back to the funding, we do have a comment here from Shalini saying, actually, EDA has funding for such research available.
Nice.
Yeah, so we'll have to check that out. Question from Stephanie. In your experience, what are the most effective ways communities have leveraged private investment to grow their ecosystems?
And I would not call myself an expert in general, but particularly on this. I would say some of the investments that I've seen that have been most beneficial have come when you have potentially like a community college or a higher education institution combined with some support organization for entrepreneurship, and then you have so again, some of your like serial entrepreneurs or successful entrepreneurs who really want to kind of give back, and that's when they would partner to develop some sort of, again, like say for instance an accelerator or some sort of pitch competition or programming. Pitch competitions are actually a great example because a lot of times you have private organizations pitching in some money to give to the winners. Startup weekends the same. So, and a lot of that is again talking to those successful entrepreneurs who want to give back, and who have grown up and have that connection to the community already. I would say those are kind of the different activities that I've seen where there's been that private-public partnership.
When you were talking about the what planners can do and the role of government, one thing I was thinking, and this phrase kept popping into my head, which is a fairly common one, and that is one-stop shopping. In your the weaknesses slide that you showed, you talked about how there was this disconnection amongst agencies. That this seems to be a really important role for government and for planners working in government to try to help coordinate the permitting and the resources so that entrepreneurs only have to go to one place to get all the information they need. Would you say that's right?
That would be ideal, yes. I would say at the very least, make sure that your different government agencies and offices know the system and know where where an entrepreneur or small business owner needs to go. But ideally, having a one-stop shop. I know a lot of workforce systems do that, and it's proven to be very beneficial.
Okay, well, we are out of questions now, so we'll probably want to wrap it up. Sarah, I want to thank you for this really good presentation. It's been very interesting for me without a background in economic development, so it's been fun. And I want to remind folks that if you want to register log your CM credits, the event number for this is 9135185 in the APA system. You can also search by the sponsor, which is APA's Economic Development Division. And that's all for today. Thanks a lot, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.